The organisation that I direct is a research organisation focusing very much on areas of policy that link both environment and development issues. A typical example of that would be climate change. Climate change has been seen in the past as something to do with the environment, but increasingly people realise that climate change has got deeply important, significant impacts on development and economic prospects for the world as a whole, but particularly for poor countries. My own background is very much from Africa, particularly from West Africa. And so I'm particularly interested in looking at how climate change will bring a whole series of impacts to different parts of the continent, and what adaptation measures might be feasible to protect African populations from climate change, and what sorts of opportunities might climate change also bring. There are a whole number of reasons why Africa is likely to be particularly badly hit, partly to do with its very heavy reliance on agriculture and natural resources, partly due to the poverty of many of its people, which make them particularly vulnerable to shocks and stresses generated by climate change, and partly because governments in many countries are not very able to protect their populations in an effective manner. I think we do have to recognise that there are likely to be major consequences for things like crop productivity. All of the crop models seem to show climate change bringing lower yields, lower harvests. There are also likely to be reduced water availability. Water is obviously absolutely fundamental, not only to crop growth, but also, of course, to livestock and to human existence. So if water supplies become less, then that's likely to have quite a dramatic impact. I think what that means, though, is that we need to work with a range of different African organisations to work out how water might be better managed. So, for instance, various forms of simple soil and water conservation can actually have dramatic effects, even in areas with low rainfall. If you can catch rainfall and use it for crop growth, rather than letting it drain away and erode your soils, then that can make a big difference. At the moment, we've got the global negotiations for the next phase of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Kyoto Protocol. The current phase finishes in 2012. So at the moment, people are negotiating what will follow 2012. And that obviously needs to focus attention on two things. One is, how do we get cuts in emissions, not only in rich countries, but also in the newly emerging economies of China, India, Brazil, and elsewhere that are starting to generate very significant quantities of greenhouse gases. And that has been the main focus for negotiations to date. But we ain't going to get a global deal unless we also look at adaptation. How can we, in the West in particular, help that process of adaptation take place? What will it comprise? What mix of activities at local level? What does it mean for what national governments should be doing? And so on. It's remarkable for anybody who goes into many parts of rural Africa today how things like the mobile phone have just taken off. And you see the same kind of leapfrogging of technology with solar power. There are lots of new forms of technology that could really make a big difference and be low carbon as well. So that's a win-win. I mean, you've seen that in the transition of the Organisation for African Union shifting into becoming the African Union, but it is a slow process, inevitably. It's taken us 50 years to build the European Union to where we are today, and I think that process of bringing countries together, agreeing on a collective agenda, ensuring the resources are pooled to achieve that collective agenda, that takes time. It's bound to take time. But there's some very impressive people in the African Union today. And I think that with support and with good relations with like-minded bodies like the European Union, that strengthening of the continental union should move ahead well. That whole approach of the Grameen Bank is enormously powerful, and bit by bit it is in fact starting to come into many parts of Africa. You see microfinance initiatives here and there. If that could be scaled up significantly, I think it'd be a thoroughly good thing. The kind of market economy which is going to work needs to be designed by the country and society where it operates. I think that the untrammeled capitalist forces that have been unleashed in some places have been thoroughly unhelpful, in the sense that they've generated increasing inequities, they've generated a land grab, and the disempowerment of many parts of society. Even in a country like China that has such a strong socialist tradition, the last 2 decades of capitalist growth have meant that inequalities between rich and poor, between the west of the country and the east, have grown alarming. So alarming that the political leaders now realise that they're sitting on a powder keg that they need to do something about. I think we need to reassert the importance of government playing a role in designing what the economy should do, so that you don't have a market economy that runs entirely out with the objectives of society as a whole. My main point is that, combined with a strong concern with cutting carbon emissions here and now, we must also address the impacts of climate change, which are also here and now. I think it's a global justice issue because, to be honest, it's countries in the West that, since the Industrial Revolution, have burnt large amounts of fossil fuel and have stuffed up, if you like, the global atmosphere, so it's now almost full. We've benefited from that cheap fuel, generating emissions, generating economic growth, improvements in our own lifestyle and well-being. But the consequence of that is that there's much less room in the global atmosphere for other people to emit from burning fossil fuels. And so I think we do have to find some sort of accommodation of our responsibility and their rights and needs. That's why I think there's a justice issue involved.